First Friday Colloquia presentation. My name is Mihaela Bugiu. I'm a research scientist at the Crane Center. And today I have the pleasure of introducing our guest, Dr. Pamela Salsberry, who is a professor in the College of Nursing and the College of Public Health. And she has been serving as the director of the PhD program in the College of Nursing for the past 7 years. She's also associate director of the Institute for Population Research in the College of Public Health, and is a very accomplished scholar, has a long list of publications and grants, so it's too long for me to get into that. Her primary research interest is in social justice in health, and specifically on the relationships between disadvantage and health. And today she will talk to us about the influence of early life environments on adolescent outcomes. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Salsberry.
Thank you. So I should probably correct one thing. So the Institute of Population Health is a NICHD-funded pop center that's really out of College of Arts and Sciences. So just I want to make sure it gets in the. That's right. Make sure. Oh, I should check the website. Make sure it gets in the right place. I want to thank Laura and others for inviting me here today, and also for giving me an opportunity to talk in one of the few buildings I've never talked in on this campus. I've been around for a fairly long time in many different capacities, and I think have been in most of the buildings doing something. But I think today's the first day I've ever been in this building. So there you are. So I have this title, The Influence of Early Life Environments on Adolescent Outcomes, and I'm going to talk broadly with a broad stroke today. I'm not going to get into a lot of nitty-gritty details, and so if folks want those, I'm happy to talk about it. I'm going to try to make a broader point as I move through my discussion, and I'm open to questions. We can do this informally. I am not at all put off by questions through the talk. Sometimes if you wait to the end, you forget what it was, and then you, at least if you're as old as I am, you want to make sure those things come up at the right time. So I wanted to acknowledge, again, the work that you're going to see and the results of the sort of 3 little studies that I'm going to present is the result of work that a team has done. It's not anything that I've individually done. This is a group that we have been successful at getting some NIH funding to support this. Just a quick beginning outline to just give you a roadmap and where I'm going to go. I'm going to talk generally about early life conditions. In particular, I'm interested in poverty and diversity, as you can probably guess from my interest in social justice, and think about child outcomes. And then I'm just going to give a hint about mechanisms and have us begin to think about the underlying stress response and what may be happening in understanding and explaining outcomes that we're seeing. I'm going to give you some quick details about 3 different studies with some 3 different results, focusing on intrauterine life, some maternal behaviors, and then parenting. And then have some discussion about policy implications both for practice and research. So early poverty and child outcomes. This is no surprise to anybody in this room, and that is that poverty matters with respect to cognitive development and educational outcomes. You know, I could have gone into any data source and found data. You might want to argue about what the years are, but the clear hierarchy is those below poverty are less successful in school, and those living in high-resourced families are most successful in school. It turns out that same finding occurs with health. And so if we look at something like BMI, which is related to weight, adult BMI is linked to low household income during the prenatal and first year of life, independent in some sense of what happens in between. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. And most importantly, the experience of poverty during early childhood is a potent predictor of adult health, adult chronic disease in midlife and older. We're also now finding that early life poverty and early life adversity is strongly linked to cognitive decline in the aging process. And so we see these significant health challenges associated with these things that happen in early life. So we have both health and educational outcomes that we are in fact finding with respect to poverty. So the sort of point was made that I was interested in sort of social justice and health. You know, the elevator speech that we're all told we have to create so that we are in conferences and we have 30 seconds to tell somebody what you're interested in or what your question is. I like to say this: I've always been interested in why poverty matters. And I think at first you think, well, that's a pretty obvious question and with some pretty obvious answers. It turns out it's not that obvious and not that easy to answer. That is, why does poverty matter to education, to health, to this whole range of outcomes that we now know it influences? One of the reasons that we are learning that it matters is because it matters about the inputs. And inputs meaning the quality and quantity of experiences that are associated with material resources. So one problem with poverty is that the material resources that are available to the families and children are different. They're of lower quality, and in terms of the dosage or quantity of those resources are much less. It's also true that families living in poverty are frequently living in housing stock that is poorer, that is in communities where they're exposed to chemicals that is detrimental to their long-term health. So the material resources, that is the amount of money they have for their housing, for their food, so food quality becomes an important one, the quality of what they can purchase with respect to enrichment. So money matters, and it matters in a very sort of direct way. Poverty also matters with respect to timing, and so it becomes, and it's a very interesting, I'm very interested in this question in terms of timing, and that is when there is a specific episode of significant deprivation or disadvantage or adversity, it matters to when that happens in the early child. And we're learning more and more about that the earlier it happens, more likely the worse it's going to be, unless we are able to intervene and make some changes in that child's life. In particular, the work that I've done, at least in the first part of the 2000s, I was particularly interested in intrauterine life and what happened during pregnancy that impacted these outcomes. There's also an indirect relationship between poverty and its impact on parents themselves. And so the quality of these early relationships that children have with their caregivers is impacted by the poverty of their parents, and that's pretty obvious for those of you in education because we know that these families are much more stressed, chaotic, that sort of thing. Just a sort of caveat, I'm generally concerned about poverty in general and not so much about specific abuse or trauma. So there's a whole literature that is growing and very interesting and very significant about very traumatic experiences that young children have and their long-term life effects of that. I think what that does, and I think I kept one slide in to sort of highlight that, is I think that's the high end of the continuum. It tells us, in fact, how detrimental these experiences are in terms of trauma and significant abuse. But so poverty matters for many reasons, okay? So this is the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, just as a sort of an example. You're probably all familiar with this, but this is the idea that's sort of complete deprivation of early infants really leads to low neurodevelopment. And here I want to start to link this because You know, my background is also in the biological sciences first. I like to think that none of these things happen without a biological basis. And what we need to do is to try to think about what biologically is happening to explain these outcomes and these behaviors. If you're not familiar with the Bucharest, sorry, early intervention project, sorry, it was the children were left in an orphanage for in Romania a long period of time. Some were adopted out, some weren't, and then they sort of followed those children. Those that got adopted out at a younger age did better, but it's an intense picture of what can happen when children are sort of really left sort of completely on their own in really high levels of adversity. And there's some interesting work now coming out showing the biological differences in their brains. Just really nice work. I'm also interested broadly in the notion of parenting because I think parenting may provide us one strategy for interventions in the long run. The work that I'm going to present here, the empirical work, is going to be around mothers. It has to do with the database that I use. I think fathers are important. And I think we need to sort of begin to understand that in the same way that we're trying to understand why mothers are important. But again, we really have, I think we're only beginning to understand these processes. We have some nice work that's been done that shows in the mother's presence there's a dampening of a child's response, their stress response, simply with her presence in a room. There's a nice study using the Midas Study, that this is the midlife in the United States survey, which found that maternal nurturing in small children, when these folks were small kids, they remembered this or they reported on it when they were in their midlife, showed that there was no SES effect on metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is a obesity, hypertension, diabetes set of a sort of complex syndrome that's notoriously related to SES. But what the Midas study found is if the individuals who lived in low-resourced families as children, if they had recollections, because this wasn't done concurrently, if they recalled that their family life in this early period was strong and supportive, they actually had none of this metabolic syndrome. So it begins to raise, so again, these are observational studies. We're beginning to understand that there are these long-term effects of what happens in early childhood. Again, a lot of the work that has been done starting in the late 90s and early 2000s have been done with animal studies. A lot's been done with mice and rats, because you can't do this with humans. But really fascinating and interesting work that shows that the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamus pituitary axis, is under social regulation. And so, you know, this is pretty interesting idea. It's novel in the sense of the last 15 years to think about the fact that our biological processes are really under social regulation. You know, we have completely blown out of the water the sort of old nature versus nurture idea. It really is neither, or both, depending upon how you want to think about this. And so what we're finding is that the development of the HPA axis, which occurs, so here we come to timing, occurs both obviously in the fetal period, but also is undergoing significant development in the 0 to 3 age. The experiences that infant and child has matters because it matters biologically. It's actually programming the systems that are being laid down and priming that child for long-term life course responses to their environment. You know, this is sort of interesting, and some of the criticisms of this sort of theoretical approach has been that people are concerned that it's too deterministic, that it means that we can't intervene, we can't change the life course of kids who may have experienced significant adversity. But what we're finding is that there are ways in which we can intervene, and if you think about the fact that if experiences matter in this sort of negative way, experiences are going to matter in a positive way too, if we can figure out what the right experiences are going to be to alter these trajectories. I mean, there's increasing evidence in the study that we've done. I'm going to suggest this. The relationships are quite complex, and that there's evidence that social conditions can only buffer so much adversity. I'm also particularly interested in race, black-white differences, and some of our findings would suggest that in African Americans, we don't get quite the same sort of buffering that we get in whites.
So I don't know much about the HPA axis, but I'm trying to, can I see if I understand what, oh, you're going to go into it. So
just briefly.
But are you saying then that having a responsive parent
yes.
helps a child be able to regulate their own?
Absolutely, that's exactly right.
With stress?
Yes, okay. Yes. And so it's functions, yes.
But you're also saying positively responsive.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, yes, but the experiences of parenting is going to affect how my HPA axis gets set, and so if it's, and what I'm going to test in the study that I'm going to show you is really whether or not warm parenting in early life can buffer against adversity as defined by poverty, and I'm going to look at educational and health outcomes. And so that's where we're going to go, with the idea that it gets set up early. This programming gets set up. And the HPA axis is a lot of it. You might have, if you're not familiar with it, but you probably have heard of cortisol. And so it's part of the biological system that drives how we respond, the fight or flee kind of thing. And while you need that, you don't want that to be in motion all of the time, because once it's in motion all of the time, you're going to get physiological damage to your arteries. Your blood pressure will go up. You will develop obesity, probably obesity that is more abdominally related. You more likely are be higher risk for diabetes, and so this cascade of problems. And so this is just a way to say it's also related to executive function, and so how one is able to self-regulate, and that's what I think is, again, one of the things. I'm jumping to the end, but I think that interests both your approach in education with young children and executive function and self-regulation and cognitive ability and school readiness and those sorts of outcomes. Those are the same, those processes are driven by a set of biological processes that also really drive health. And so we really overlap in what we're interested in. And we, I'm going to argue, and I've been working with Laura and her group for a little bit, what we really want to do is pull together and think about how we do both of these, sort of what sometimes has been disparate parts of campus, right, health and education, how we think about this process for for early child well-being. So that's the end of my talk. So let me let me go ahead and we can come back if that's not. I just want to say, because in some audiences they're very concerned about this deterministic point, that is, if in fact we've got this biological programming that occurs early on, that means we can't alter it. There was a nice review in pediatrics that just came out, and that's what this is just referencing, that says that we can alter how cortisol regulation occurs, and that we can do this through some psychosocial interventions. This was a systematic review, and it's really, I put it up here just to remind myself to make sure you knew about this paper, which is a really nice paper if you've got interested in the sort of cortisol mechanisms. So I have a couple slides to sort of try to tie this together from a framework perspective. And so I like to think about health trajectories and health trajectories across time. And so, you know, these are the gene-environment interactions that we think a lot about in the health sciences. And I'm not at all a genetics person, so don't think that by the mere fact I've put these words up here that I'm going to be able to speak to a lot of genetics. But the idea here is, and again, this is this notion that we're no longer in a nature-nurture, is that we have some hardware, or we're hardwired to a certain extent, but how we express our genetic code is very much influenced by the environments that we're in. And we need to really, and we're only beginning to understand that. And we really have very little understanding about how we manipulate that for the good. That is, to take children who might have really significant adversity, manipulate that environment to treat them to improve their long-term life course trajectories. You know, so we get this notion of a genetic structure that gets interacted with things like, and these are sort of the three key ones that people like Shonkoff at Harvard and his Early Child Adversity Center talk about, and that's the quality of nutrition. This includes breastfeeding, of course. Environments broadly thought about as environments. So it could be poverty, it can be chemical pollutants, and then this importance of relationships. You know, these sorts of things bring on brain and biological development, and lots of writing, at least in the health science side of early childhood, a lot of discussion about the biological embedding of early life experiences. And then we get this expressed in all sorts of ways. I think the first two are primarily of concern for the people in this room, right? So you do a lot of work to try to think about the social emotional development of young children and the cognitive and learning that young children do. You know, clearly my side of campus worries more about the health, mental health and physical health of young children. But as we have come to understand, this isn't limited to pediatrics. So if I want to embark now on a primary prevention plan to reduce chronic disease in middle adults, I may want to work in early childhood because that's really the only place I'm going to be able to do primary prevention. And so the study that I'm going to talk about parenting. I don't have biomarkers. But this is sort of trying to make sure that there's a biological plausibility to the studies that I put together. And it's going to be evidenced in better school performance and better health behaviors. So if you think about especially health behaviors that require some individual monitoring of behaviors that may be eating or physical activity. Self-regulation is key to that, you know, and self-regulation is going to be key to school success. And so it's this underlying beginnings that occur 0 to 3 in how children are able to regulate their own behaviors. Whoops, let me throw these up here quickly. So this is the other way I like to think about this, and this is trajectories, and a health trajectory, let's say, from 0 to 5, and ways in which you can get positive influencer factors that can up the trajectory, and you could also put health on this. On other groups that I've done this, you can put health, so you get improved health. You get a downward pushing of these trajectories by stressors and things like, again, for health, lack of health services, and poverty for both. So let me jump to the studies. So I'm going to quickly go through 3 of the studies that we've done to make 3 points that I hope will be integrated by the end of this. Okay? All of the work that I'm going to talk about today has used the National longitudinal survey of youth, and some of you in this room may have also used the NOSY for various purposes. It's a great database, as again, some of you know, especially related to education outcomes over the life course. I'm particularly interested in the child and young adult surveys. I'll talk a little bit about that. This is the sort of general sample sizes that are in the three studies that we're going to see. About 1,900 to 2,000 females. Again, I'm particularly interested in black-white differences because I'm interested in explaining health disparities. And you know, so that we have a nice number of African Americans. We do have siblings in the NOSY, so we have to always worry about making sure that our analyses account for that lack of independence. So this just is a visual to give you a sense of the data collection processes in the NOSY, in case you're not familiar with it. The NOSY is basically funded by BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It has been funded since 1979, the group that I'm interested in, which is the mother data. So they took a birth cohort from 1957 to 64. This is a national data set. They started collecting data in 79. They continue to collect data. Now they collect it every 2 years. Initially, they collected it yearly. It got too expensive to do it yearly. And it's if I didn't say it, it's a national group. Started with about 11,000 individuals. It's now, I think, slightly under 9, maybe. They've done a fabulous job of retention, if you think about it, over 40 years of retaining those folks. I'm primarily or almost exclusively interested in the women of this group because I'm interested in the mothers, and I'm interested in the biological children born to the mothers. And I think in the three studies, no, one of the studies you'll see I have boys in it, and some of the studies I'm interested primarily in just females. In '86, again, through no credit of mine, a smart person decided they wanted to apply to NIH for funding to collect data on the children born to the women. So since 1986, there's been data collected on the children born to the NOSY, and that also continues today. So you've got this nice longitudinal cohort, lots of problems with the data, but there are lots of things that are extraordinary in the data sets that you're not going to find in other data sets in the US. And you know, if you've got interest in that. First of all, it's got an oversample of African Americans at a time when there wasn't a lot of that, so there's been you can really go into the data set to try to learn some things about race differences. Okay, so what kind of measures can I get out of this, or what kind of things are we interested in, just to sort of let you know. So there are the three studies, just to give you a highlight. I'm going to talk about obesity as related to intrauterine life. I'm going to talk about educational outcomes as related to parenting, and then I'm going to talk about cognitive outcomes related to intrauterine life. So those are my three sort of quick studies that we'll go through. So some of the things that the outcomes that we get are we can get out of these data. We can get BMI. BMI on the kids was actually measured early on, so it's the only measured sort of biological data that we have out of the NOSY. We get educational attainment, and because these kids, for the most part, are now, you know, in their 30s and 40s, we have a completed cycle of education for these kids. We have the ability to develop cumulative measures. So we have developed many cumulative adversity measures. In the study that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about the amount of poverty the child's lived in from 0 to 5. We also have the Holmes scores, which, again, most of you in this room are probably familiar with, which allows us to come up with a measure of very warm parenting. If you know the Holmes score and know that Bradley has out there ways in which you can get summary scores. We actually use, Jeannie Brooks Guns has an alternative measure. We used hers in coming up with a very warm parenting. We have, because we had information on these women before they got pregnant, we have lots of pre-pregnancy information.
Did you look at, I'm sort of more interested in the adolescent side of this.
Okay.
Did you look at adolescent outcomes?
That's what we're going to look at. Yeah, yeah.
What outcomes in?
So we've looked at educational attainment is what I'm going to report on today. So I've looked at other things, but we're going to look at educational attainment of the kids, and we're going to look at BMI. We've also looked at things like age of menarche. So that's my sort of interest in females. Again, it's related to a lot of different things. It is one of those markers that we have. I'm not reporting on any behavioral outcomes in here, but we've done work in behavioral outcomes, and you can do work in behavioral outcomes with this database. And so maternal smoking during pregnancy and a race variable. So again, I'm not going to, for those of you who are in here because you wanted to hear all about the statistics, I've tried to leave this sort of light on that side. But so I'll have logistic regressions reported for the obesity. I'll have some sample characteristics, and then we ran OLSs for the regressions for BMI and education, and then some interactions that I want to talk about. So ask me when we get to the slides. So here's research question 1, and I'm going to talk about it as being old news. And the questions in this one was, is there a relationship between maternal smoking and child obesity measured at various points across the child's life course? And is there a relationship between maternal pre-pregnancy weight status and child overweight and obese status? It's old news because this is really well accepted at this point. That is, it's well accepted that maternal smoking has a pretty strong effect on obesity in adolescents and adults. So if your mother smoked when you were in utero, you're going to have a harder time probably with maintaining your weight as an adult or as an adolescent. The maternal pre-pregnancy weight, and I've got it, this next slide will give you the odds ratios on this. Now, when we first did this study, which was like, we started in '99 and early 2000s, these things really weren't established. The thought about smoking was that it was probably a function of SES, because smoking is more related to lower socioeconomic status, and so the thought was that the weight status of the kids, of mothers who smoked during pregnancy, was really about the social conditions that the kids lived in. Since that time, and since these observational studies really have really strongly supported this link, and actually there is a meta-analysis done with this, about 10 studies that have been done across the world. All of our odds ratios turn out to be about the same when it comes to the risk for smoking. And so these are at three ages. We also have similar odds ratios into the teens, and so all this does, and I tried not to clutter it up with all of the other things that we had in here. What's important here is to see if the mother smoked during pregnancy at 2 or 3, that is at age 2 or 3, the child had a 1.37 times greater odds of being overweight at time T2, which in this study was at 4 or 5. It increases to 1.42, and then at 6 to 7, it's 1.74. So we get this it gets greater as the child ages.
Are you going to tell us why?
Well, we're not entirely sure why. There are some theories about actually biological mechanisms. It was first thought that it was nicotine's a vasoconstrictor, and so there was some thought that it was hypoxia or low oxygen levels that weren't, so low oxygen levels were getting, the fetus wasn't getting enough. It's well known that babies born to mothers who smoke are much lighter. They have lower birth weights. And there's also this U phenomena with birth weight and obesity. So babies born at low birth weights and high birth weights tend to be obese as adults. Again, different mechanisms, but it's at the small size, it's thought to be about, again, it's a programming issue. That is programming in the sense of biologically. If the fetus is small, there may be fewer. They're also at higher risk for diabetes. They believe there's fewer beta cells put down in the pancreas. So you get this sort of snowball effect with this behavior of smoking. It also may have to do with, there's increasing research being done on this question, so the answer isn't all in. It may also have to do with other metabolites or chemicals that are associated with smoking that crosses, that has negative effects on the biology.
And has anyone looked at a filter which takes into consideration issues like regulation, like if someone is addicted, that means that they're missing developmental abilities, like to, they have substances which substitute for things that they should be doing, but they don't have ingredients to be doing them, so they're going to addictive substances to sort of like...
So you're thinking it's not the smoking per se?
Well, I'm wondering, could it also be as a factor that if a mom is addicted, she is missing some psychological intelligence, which she's not then able to use when she parents her children. And when she's got her kid, when they're driving down a strip with, they're being bombarded by advertisement from McDonald's and Wendy's and along the whole strip, then all of a sudden the addiction jumps from smoking in a 5-year-old to obesity.
You're right, it's a very complex problem. Part of it is, you can't do randomized controlled trials to sort of sort that completely out. There's ways to bring in attempts to put in controls or confounders when you do, the studies. I mean, we did, when we first did this study, we did look at, there is other data in the NOSY on drug use and I believe alcohol use. There was a fair amount of missing data, and so we really weren't able to use those variables in a meaningful way, and so it's the challenge of the empirical work and sorting it out. But your point is that there's this altered self-regulation behaviors in an addicted individual. There's this building of her own HPA axis, her own psychological state that gets transferred. I would say that there is some attempts now to do some concurrent biological work that looks at the mother's own sort of a functioning HPA axis and then what the child's functioning HPA axis is. You might think it has something to do with genetics. There's this notion that epigenetic changes are actually intergenerationally passed on. We don't know how many generations that is going to happen. That's just completely unknown at this point.
Is all development necessarily biological and therefore trackable in that way? Like, for example, let's say I missed an experience in early childhood which, embedded an automatic process inside of me for regulation. And consequently, I never learned skills of discipline and self-control. But that's not really biological.
Well,
What is it?
Well, I think, I have to say, standing up here, I have to say that our behavior is going to be, it's not ethereal. It's biologically based. That is, that we're going to have a biological explanation for it. Now, the one thing that I would correct or say that I would, in your scenario you just talked about, we worry that we think that there are, we think there are critical periods, right? I mean, there's so much of this that we don't know. But if one misses a critical period and an experience, the real question that's out there for us all is when and what can we substitute to improve the outcomes in the long run? I mean, I think that's really the challenge over the next 10 years, is how do we figure that out? Yeah.
So it looks like your odds ratios are going up as kids age.
Yes.
Is there a base rate change, or are the odds ratios really going up?
What I didn't do, just because I was going to do this slide quickly, and now I'm sorry that I didn't put the next slide in. We did some Markov modeling, and then in the second slide, we did it conditional on their prior state. And yes, they do continue to go up, but it's a little, I'm not going to remember it off the top of my head, sorry. The point of this one was just to say, this intrauterine life, that was my point of this slide, was the intrauterine life is important, and it's important probably for some biological reasons. Because we have put, so again, when we first did this, I was a real naysayer about the pre-pregnancy weight. I thought we were going to be able to explain it away. I thought we were going to be able to explain away the pre-pregnancy weight associations or relationships with these increasing overweight and obesity. There is nothing we can put in that knocks these out, and they continue to get greater. I mean, so we've got pretty sophisticated ways to control for socioeconomic status in this data set. We can control for maternal weight gain over the period. We can control for maternal weight gain during pregnancy. We can control for maternal weight gain. So we've also done a paper in adolescents, which shows something very, we'll just continue it up, shows something very similar, and we looked at the maternal weight gain during that 14 years, as well as the child's weight gain during those 4 years, thinking that it was her eating habits in the family. And there's some relationship there, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't knock out this pre-pregnancy weight effects. And there's been some other interesting, people have done other interesting studies, particularly with bariatric surgery. I don't know if any of you heard these. So really interesting studies of women who were morbidly obese for one pregnancy, and then their weights and metabolic profiles are better for their second pregnancy. And there's huge differences in the child outcomes, even in the same family, So all holding, in some sense, steady all of these other family things. So let me sort of pop through the next few. So this is the other one I at least want to get to. So this is the one, this is looking at parenting in early life and its effect on adolescent outcomes. So here, who wanted to know about adolescent outcomes? So this one is going to be about adolescent outcomes. We're going to worry about young adult attained BMI and educational outcomes. This is just my sort of musings about the mechanisms and how this matters in terms of executive function. And this notion of a nurturing mother may actually be able to buffer the effects because of this effect on the HPA axis. Again, I want to point out that I haven't talked a lot about, but fundamentally one of the questions that drives what we do is about race differences. So again, and you're going to see that pop up here. So here's just an example of the data. You'll notice that the BMIs are going to be higher for African Americans throughout. Their educational attainment is a little lower. They're going to be in much greater poverty. 72% of their early life is spent in poverty as compared to 29%. We have, in terms of the percent of time they've experienced warm parenting, that's what that is. We then interacted never living in poverty with warm parenting and living in poverty with warm parenting, because we wanted to know whether or not there was a differential effect for those two groups. And you can probably guess, if I have it up here, you're going to see something on the outcomes. And then these other sorts of controls. So this is the regression on the young adult BMI. And what we found is that if a child lived in poverty but had warm parenting, they actually were less likely to end up with a higher BMI. So it provides some sort of a buffer against living in poverty. It doesn't do that if you don't live in poverty. Okay, so this again begins to speak to the complexity of what's going on here. And then this other things are just the controls that we would have expected to find. We knew we're going to, as I talked about, the pre-pregnancy maternal BMI, maternal smoking, and these were just controls for the age and being African American. In terms of education, again, these are sort of pretty interesting results. Let me go back to this one. While we found it, I forgot to mention, while we find it in the full sample, the effect, we don't find it for African Americans. Okay, so we have a differential process going on there. We do some hypothesizing about why that is, and I'll do that in a minute. We get, an effect for the whites. For education, we get it across the board. So again, children living in poverty, parenting matters, is what this is suggesting. And it matters for both African Americans and white kids. Okay. And again, we just have the sort of regular old controls in there. I think we can't forget when we start to talk about warm parenting, about what predicts warm parenting, and I didn't want to throw up another slide here about that. Who's able to have the skill set and the time and resources for warm parenting are people likely not to be in poverty. And so there is a fairly large campaign in Scotland currently on parenting, and it's a very interesting campaign because they're walking a very fine line between individual rights about how one parents a child. As you can imagine, that would be a discussion that might crop up here in the US. With a individual blaming of parents. And so the idea here is that you talk about these things in a way in which we think about what's the resources that are necessary, what are the social safety net issues that need to be in place in order to give families the opportunity to do this warm parenting. If warm parenting turns out to be one intervention that can lead to these better outcomes, it's not that we can go along and we don't have good outcomes in terms of teaching moms to be better moms or something like that, out of the context of the whole multi-level approach. Okay? So you might be interested in this one. So this is the last quick one I'll go through. Let me just say, so this one is trying to combine and have you think about cognitive outcomes with what's happening in the intrauterine life, and in particular with moms who are obese. Okay? And I say here the plot thickens because I want you to see that this just complicates the story even more. And this is actually work that was done by one of my PhD students. So we get this maternal pre-pregnancy obesity, and we have these particular problems of this is just high lipids, hypertension, gestational diabetes, and so we get this adipose tissue. She got very interested in work that showed in older adults that Alzheimer's and dementia was associated with individuals with metabolic syndrome. And so she began to ask the question about whether or not early child development's brains were affected by the metabolic processes in utero. Okay, so that's what drove her to ask these questions. And so this is just one OLS that I'll show just in terms of time. But again, this is NOSY data, and she asked the question of whether or not moms who were obese during pregnancy, and the assumption there is, again, you have to go with it, is that in obese moms that there are probably some metabolic issues in her own physiological state that gets transmitted across the placenta, and affects the fetal development cognitively or the brain. And so she just asked whether or not, so again, those of you who know the NLSY know they've done the PIOT 1,000 times on these kids. But this is at the first age you could do it. I think it's at age 5 and 6. And just ask whether or not there was a difference in PIOT scores of kids born to obese moms versus none. Okay? Again, testing this notion that in utero life that has been influenced by perhaps a mom who's got metabolic problems is going to affect their sort of fundamental brain structure. We don't have all of the biomarkers that we would love to have to be able to truly test this. So this is simply an observation. It's an association. We can't say that it's causal, but she found some pretty interesting results. And that is that we get a reduced development at 5 in children born to obese women. Again, controlling for all the kinds of things that you would want to control for, family background, maternal factors, other child factors. What's interesting about this finding is about 6 months later, there was a paper that came out in pediatrics using the Avon cohort out of the UK, and I'm pretty sure it was the Avon cohort. It may have been the Millennium cohort, but they found almost identical results to what we found. And so, again, there are other longitudinal surveys that are trying to look at this question. Much work has to be done to create an answer to why this is. But the plot thickens in the sense that, it's not, we've got all of these layers of influences on cognitive development that begins obviously, at conception, essentially. So, conclusions. First of all, as I said, this is what I've done pretty much for the last 8 or 10 years, but the intrauterine environment matters, both for long-term health and educational attainment. They're very much interconnected. I think this notion that education cares about cognition and reading, and health cares about physical health and mental health, this divide, we really have to sort of figure out how we start doing studies together and develop the mechanism work underneath as well as the outcome data.
Where does developmental maturation fit into those? If you break it out into cognition and readiness in the education camp and mental health in the other camp, like where does the personal development maturation piece fit
Well, in the framework that I generally live within, I think of development across the whole trajectory, okay? And so this whole piece is a sort of child development. And there are ways in which we might spin off ways to look at various components of it. But we really are interested in, if you remember my curves, what we really want are to get child development high curves. And it's going to take a focus on many things to get us there, especially on kids who tend to start out at a lower spot than other kids. So, again, big question is how we raise, especially the lower part of the curve higher up. So I don't see development or maturation as a separate piece of this.
Well, it's not articulated by many people, and I'm wondering if that's perhaps a mistake. Like when we're educating and when we're doctoring kids, if no one has their eye on the ball of maturation, then we could end up with healthy kids who are really smart in technology, who then decide to act out on their anger by flying planes into buildings because no one is really articulating, no one's watching developmental maturation.
Well, what I think you're talking about is sort of the psychological and mental health component. I think that's really wrapped up into the trajectories. I don't think you would get to a healthy child. I don't think you would get somebody to say you have a healthy child who's got those sorts of behaviors.
Who is immature developmentally.
But there's probably, we could probably trace it back to these early life exposures that affect it.
I have a question. This is really provocative. And so I think what you're saying in the data you shared is you have information about what happened to kids in an intrauterine environment. The mother was obese or the mother was smoking. And then later in time, you're looking at something about the kids. Now, I don't do this work, and so this is actually an honest question I'm asking. So when you go to publish this work, and you say, you know, these differences in cognition we see across kids at 5 for mothers who are obese or weren't or smoked or not, do people buy? Can you publish and say, this is a study of the intrauterine environment without having really detailed information about life from birth?
Well, first of all, I've done this broad stroke here.
Okay.
So in the papers, you would get some of those details. I mean, I didn't want
So
to...
you would say, like, we controlled for...
Yes, I didn't want to get bogged down in the details, quite frankly. I wanted to sort of provide the broad stroke. I sort of alluded to that when I talked about the pre-pregnancy weight and trying to knock it out with everything that you could think of that you could knock it out with. That sort of, you know, and that, so that's what we did. We put, you know, a long list of confounders, and shockingly, from my perspective, barely budges the coefficients, barely budges them. I mean, and when you get similar findings across studies, other studies, it provides some confirmation. The other piece of this that I haven't talked about, because it's not work that I do, there is a whole world of biological work that's going on underpinning these observations. So we have folks doing functional MRIs that are looking at what brains look like and how they are functioning. And so as you do the work, you really have to pull together a story that ties that in. And so when I alluded to it, I'm sorry, because I was just trying to do something quick here. I'm very careful to be sure that we've got at least a biologically plausible story, even if all I'm presenting is observational data, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
That's really what I feel like I have to be able to do. I have to tell a biological, you know, I can get my observations, I have a thinking behind why I think it happens, and it has to be biologically plausible. You build that biological plausibility up through other either rat, mice studies. And again, they're not perfect, right? There are lots of ways in which we're not like rat and mice, fortunately. But they're intriguing. And I think this is where a lot of the science is going. I think it really argues for team science and why you have to have different people at the table because they have different perspectives on these problems. So I'd say it's very much interconnected, it's complex, and we shouldn't be studying these problems separately. We should be trying to sort of piece them, sit down and think about them together. In terms of the buffering effect, I said I'll end with this, but at least try to give you some ideas about why we think we find black-white differences in the sort of BMI and buffering issue. One is that percent time in poverty doesn't really capture the significant difference in the persistence and depth of poverty between our white and black subjects. It is pretty sobering when you look at the level of disadvantage of the African American families in this NOSY survey. Many have 0 to negative assets. So we've also done work on wealth and assets. Many of the African American families have, again, 0 or negative assets compared to whites. And so even if you get whites who always have lived in poverty and blacks who always have lived in poverty, those mean income differences are really striking. I mean, just really striking. It could be 10 times different. So I think there may be something, so the adversity experience, this is all hypothesis, okay? The experiences are so much more persistent and deeper that it may not be enough to have a mom who is able to provide you with a warm environment. It may be that you're just getting beat down by so many other things that it's not enough to overcome that. So this is it does do education, but it didn't have any effect on BM. We also know BMIs are higher in African American women when they go into the pregnancy, so that may be part of what's going on. So we'll skip that, and we've been able to have questions along the way. But I appreciate the interaction and the questions, so thank you.
Thank you so much.